Hello, everyone. In today's deep dive, we will be covering the incredibly important topic of police brutality, specifically police sexual misconduct.
All around the world, protesters are coming together to protest police brutality in response to the heartbreaking video of George Floyd being murdered by a white police officer in broad daylight. This comes just months after the tragic killing of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. We have been honored to march alongside activists in our home state of Michigan. After hearing testimonies from those in our community, we have decided to use our platform to talk about police brutality and negligence as it relates to survivors of sexual assault and domestic abuse.
Police sexual misconduct is the second most common form of police brutality after excessive force. It can include anything from sexual harassment to forcible rape. It affects primarily women of color and LGBTQ plus people, but it can happen to anybody.
Before we jump into it, the vast majority of these stories that we will be reading today have been documented in Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color by Andrea Ritchie. It's a very insightful book, and as of now, the Kindle and the audiobook version is free on Amazon. So this is definitely an author that you're going to want to support.
As we are reading these stories, please check in with yourself. Even we had some trouble getting through these. They're incredibly upsetting. If you believe any of this content may be triggering for you, please pause the video now and skip to this timestamp.
Without further ado, let's jump right into it. For time's sake, we're only going to be sharing a few of the many cases we have found, but we have included links in the description if you're interested in learning more.
Our first story is about an officer from a small western department. That's really all we were able to find for legal reasons. He was suspended for inappropriate conduct after he sent text messages and a picture of himself to a rape victim. Prior to being suspended, he had been assigned to investigate sex crimes and was demoted for having an intimate relationship with a victim.
Our next story is about officers Duwan Guidry and Rolando Trevino from Balcones Heights in Texas. In 2002, they picked up a group of women for alleged public intoxication. These women were taken to a police station and placed in a holding cell. Then, the officers removed the women from the holding cell and placed them into a room with no video surveillance. They then ordered the women to dance to music. They sexually assaulted all of the women. One testified that she felt unable to resist or run away because, quote, he had a gun and I was singled out. I was by myself. I didn't know what door led out. I couldn't go anywhere.
Our next story is about Roger McGanna, an Oregon police officer. He was convicted in 2004 of sexual assault and rape of a dozen women over an 8-year period. He preyed on women through the war on drugs, broken windows policing, and the policing of prostitution, as well as survivors of violence and mentally ill. One woman described McGanna putting a gun against her genitals and said he would blow her insides out if she told anyone. A combination of intimidation and indifference within the police department enabled him to continue carrying out acts of sexual violence for almost a decade. Not only that, but at least half a dozen officers and supervisors had heard complaints about his conduct and dismissed them as the grumblings of drunkies and prostitutes. And yes, that's a quote.
Our next story is about an El Monte, California police officer. A Mexican trans woman was crossing the street on the way home from a friend's house when an officer groped her breasts and asked her if she was a, quote, nasty she-male. She responded that she was transsexual. He then ordered her through an alley into a deserted parking lot where he forced her to perform oral sex on him and then raped her over the trunk of his car.
Our next story is about Daniel Holtzclaw of the Oklahoma City Police. He raped at least 13 black women and was caught when he assaulted Janie Liggins on her way home from playing dominoes. Holtzclaw pulled her over, ordered her to step out of the car, and then proceeded to pat her down all over. He then forced her to sit in the back of his squad car, expose her breasts and genitals, and perform oral sex on him. After the incident, she immediately went to the police station to report him. This kicked off the investigation, which found 13 women who were willing to come forward and participate in his prosecution. In some cases, he would continue to show up at their houses to assault them. This happened with the first victim, who he raped while handcuffed to a hospital bed. These are just a few quotes from his victims. I was out there alone and helpless. I didn't know what to do. I was looking at the gun in his holster and I'm saying to myself, he's gonna shoot me in the head. I felt like even though I didn't have any warrants, he might make something up on me and send me to jail anyways. I didn't think anyone was gonna believe me anyways. I'm a drug addict. That hurts me so
Bro, I
much
have
on the
goosebumps
inside.
all over right now.
It just like shocks me that you can dehumanize someone to like that degree.
Right?
To where like you don't even see them as a person because they're like involved with drugs or the sex trade.
Our next story is about Chester Thompson, a police officer charged with assaulting women after he was called to help them. Melitra Montanez called 911 for help in February of 2015 to report that her daughters were missing. When Thompson responded to the call, he told her that she was pretty, her butt was big, and that her lips looked like they could hold a penis. Thompson then forced her to perform oral sex on him and then turned her around to face her newborn son as he raped her. After hearing her case, Kim Fletcher came forward to report repeated assaults at the hands of Thompson after calling the police about her daughters. A third woman, Shakina Thompson, came forward. She had called 911 during a dispute with her girlfriend, and Officer Thompson told her that he would file aggravated assault charges against her girlfriend if she didn't have sex with him. He came back at least twice more. 6 years before, he approached an 18-year-old girl, Liz El-Bayadi, at an outdoor concert and forcibly bent her over a porta potty and raped her. Thompson was fired and pled guilty to official misconduct, which only ended up being a misdemeanor, and he was given probation.
It's so absurd that you could not have one story like that, but four. And get probation.
These are actual rapes. I don't understand how that can be like just shoved under the rug so many times.
Even with all of these stories, we have barely even scratched the surface of those that are public. Imagine all of the stories that have gotten buried or gone unreported. Because at the end of the day, if you're assaulted by a police officer, where can you go to report it? The average reporting rate for sexual assault is about 30%. It's even lower among college students at about 10%. It's truly disturbing to think about how low that percentage could be in this power dynamic. While some people may chalk these stories up to a few bad apples, we have reason to believe this is yet another systemic issue among police officers. Penny Harrington, an officer herself, said, "There is a culture in law enforcement. You don't tell on your buddies. You get so bought into this police culture, you don't see anything wrong with it. It's like a badge of honor. How many women in the community can you have sex with, and the younger the better?" A high school trainee who was assaulted during a ride-along said there was a cesspool of sexual violence and harassment that existed in police departments across the country.
And even considering how taboo this issue is, we still have really good evidence that this is a systemic problem. In 2019, US Today found 3,145 cops under investigation for allegations of rape, child molestation, and other sexual misconduct. However, another study found that only about 260 cops are charged each year with a sex crime. This data was taken between 2005 and 2014. We already know that reporting rates for sexual assault are very, very low. But even with very few reports, we're seeing a very low percentage actually being charged. This shows how out of control this problem is and how there are virtually no consequences for this type of behavior. This problem is also much more widespread than we are led to believe. In a 2003 study of young women in New York City, almost 40% of young women said that they were sexually harassed by officers, the vast majority of them being Black or Latino. A 2014 New Orleans study found 59% of transgender respondents and 43% of people of color were asked sexual favors by police.
How?
Literally
how
how?
do you have over 50%? How is that even fucking possible?
This type of misconduct is also allowed to persist for long periods of time. 41.5% of police sexual misconduct cases involve repeat offenders who target 4 people on average. And this is largely due to police unions and contracts, which can block investigations and terminations.
Looking at this data, hearing stories, and hearing testimonies from officers, we need to ask ourselves, how did it get this bad, and why is no one talking about it? For starters, there are no official statistics on the number of rapes and sexual assaults committed by police in the US, or the number of sexual complaints received by police departments. The data we have is compiled by research teams, often using the Freedom of Information Act. Because this is so time-consuming, it's unlikely smaller police stations have ever released this type of information. How can we hold police officers and stations accountable when we don't even have that kind of data? Police have also neglected the problem and denied its existence to the point where the first official guidance on how to handle police sexual misconduct was created in 2011. That is less than 10 years ago. But it's important to note, this guidance was in no way mandatory. Only about 15% of police stations have any policy explicitly prohibiting police sexual misconduct. Lastly, and most disturbingly, in these 35 states, there is no law expressly defining sexual acts between an officer and a detainee as non-consensual. This is absolutely absurd, given that we recognize a teacher-student relationship as one with a power dynamic that could inherently be considered non-consensual. But teachers don't carry a gun or have the power to incarcerate people.
Even more than that, sexual assault is baked into policing. Since the war on drugs, police may do what's called a cavity or strip search if they believe a person may be hiding drugs under their clothing. Many people experience these types of searches as assault. Overall, it seems a little ridiculous that you can legally obtain a search warrant for a person's vagina or anus. There have been accounts of officers performing these types of searches in public spaces in full view of people passing by, as well as officers treating them like a striptease. One woman was woken up in the middle of the night by a group of officers saying they believed she was hiding drugs in her vagina. She was brought to the hospital and a doctor forcibly searched her vagina, during which no drugs were found. But all of these searches are state-sanctioned.
So, who is at the highest risk for police sexual violence, and why aren't they reporting? Almost everyone targeted for police sexual violence is a part of a vulnerable or heavily policed group. This includes women, specifically women of color, LGBTQ+ people, the majority being transgender women and lesbians of color, people known to be or perceived to be in the sex or drug trade, those who are using drugs or alcohol, people with prior arrests, immigrants and people who speak English as their second language, people with disabilities, people who have been previously targeted for police sexual violence. It's theorized in this case that these people are actually considered police property and are therefore fair game for other officers. And lastly, survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. An officer was once quoted saying, "Finding dates working with victims of domestic violence is like shooting fish in a barrel." And if that isn't one of the most disgusting things you've ever heard, I don't know what is. By targeting vulnerable people or people with arrest records, police are able to pressure their victims into staying silent.
Survivors have to take on considerable risk when reporting this type of misconduct. These risks include retaliation by police officers, criminal charges, deportation, incarceration for sex work or controlled substances, exposure of gender identity and sexual orientation, and simply not being believed.
So, what can we as citizens do to hold our officers accountable and get rid of the toxic culture that enables these assaults? Number one is, if you are in any one of these 35 states that does not expressly define sexual acts between an officer and a detainee as non-consensual, the first thing we need to be doing is contacting our state and local officials to get them to pass legislation that would automatically consider these types of sexual acts as rape or assault. We've included a link to a form email below so that you can easily advocate for this cause. All right, and this next one is for everybody. We need more transparency and citizen oversight of our police departments, but we can only do that if we're provided with the information we need to hold them accountable. That's why we've included a second form email in the description so that you can talk to your representatives about making police sexual misconduct allegations and charges public information. And third, we also need to be having conversations within our community about taking funding away from police and using it to fund resources that are better equipped to help people. We didn't really have time to get into that in this video. We're actually going to be releasing a second video next week about how defunding the police may actually help survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence.
So stay tuned for our next video, and thank you for watching this one. I know it was really hard to get through, but these are the really tough conversations that we need to have in order to actually make a change. If you enjoy our channel, please like and subscribe to show your support, and if you're looking for more resources, go ahead and follow our other social media pages like our Instagram and our Twitter, links below in the description. Thank you! We'll see you next time.